Hi guys, it has been a while since I have done a reading wrap up. In fact, I think it's been since the end of June or July. So I thought that today I would catch you up on everything I have read from the beginning of August through to the end of October, and I've got some really good books to share with you. Lots of books I've really loved from the bottom of my heart. I just love them so much, and others that I thought that I didn't love as much but thought were very interesting. So let's get into it, and I will share with you everything I have been reading for the past few months. So you may know that during August this year I hosted my Classics-a-thon, which is a readathon that I started last year, and I really love doing it. I love reading classics alongside all of you, seeing what you're reading. You always encourage me to read lots, and I did film a few reading vlogs during August, so I won't talk about those books so much because you can hear my thoughts in greater detail in those videos. But I got lots of reading done that I had wanted to do for a really long time and read a great variety of books. Didn't read all of the books on my TBR, but still had a pretty good go. So the first book that I read for the Classics-a-thon was Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf. I feel like this is the fourth, maybe the fifth Virginia Woolf book I've read now, and I love her writing. She's one of my favourite authors, and even though I find her books difficult to read at times, I find that they really challenge my brain. I still enjoy them, and I still feel like I get a lot out of them. One of the really special things about reading this book was that I got a second-hand copy of it, and somebody had already annotated it with their thoughts, which I found really enriching. Some people don't like reading books other people have read and written notes in, but I love it because I love seeing if my thoughts will match theirs and what I think, whether I agree or disagree. I love getting a point in the right direction at times when I'm not really sure if I've understood something. So I really liked that part of reading it, and I read this in the middle of a heatwave, which was very atmospheric. This follows Jacob, who is a small boy at the beginning of the book, and you follow him throughout his life during the course of the novel. I think that if you've never read any Virginia Woolf, then this might be a good place to start because there is slightly more structure to it than some of her other novels like The Waves or like Mrs. Dalloway. I found that I was able to read it at a steady pace because of the way that it was structured, not too quickly but not too slowly either, so I wasn't getting too bored of it. Jacob is a really interesting main character because you don't actually hear a lot about him. You don't really get a sense of who he is from his own perspective. Instead, you're reading about him through the lives of others. Virginia Woolf has a stream of consciousness style, and whilst this is one of her earlier works, you really feel this begin to develop. You really feel her beginning to write in her true voice. There were lots of very memorable parts of the book, but there was a line that really stuck with me, and I'll read you the whole paragraph. It says, "Anyhow, whether undergraduate or shop boy, man or woman, it must come as a shock about the age of 20, the world of the elderly, thrown up in such black outline upon what we are, upon the reality, the moors and Byron, the sea and the lighthouse, the sheep's straw with the yellow teeth in it, upon the obstinate, irrepressible conviction which makes use so intolerably disagreeable. I am what I am, and I intend to be it, for which there will be no form in the world unless Jacob makes one for himself." I love that saying, I am what I am and I intend to be it. For me, that just sums up what I think that my life motto is. I am what I am, and I don't like to think about what anyone else is and what anyone else is doing and how that affects you. But really that's what the book is about. It's about Jacob being who he is whilst everyone around him is looking in on him, looking in on his room. Really, I feel like his room is where he is his best, where he is his truest self. It's this very insular thing in a lot of landscapes which are very open in the book, or very large, and his room in comparison is very small. So Jacob's Room was a book that really touched me, really spoke to me in many ways, and is one that I'll definitely be rereading at some point because I'd love to read it again and see if my thoughts on it have changed. I don't feel like it's my favourite Virginia Woolf book. I feel like Mrs. Galloway is probably my favourite, and I don't think a lot is going to change that, but I still thought it was absolutely amazing, and I don't think it would be a terrible place to start if you haven't read any Virginia Woolf books yet. Next up, I read The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, and I did film my reading vlog on this, so you'll be able to see my thoughts from start to finish. It's a very long video, so I had lots to share on it, so I'm not going to talk about this one anymore. But after that, I read The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell, and even though I also filmed a reading vlog on this, I didn't film the reading vlog of my entire experience reading it. I just chose a snippet. So I will talk briefly about this. This is Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte. It was one of the first, if not the first, biography of a female author written by a female author, and it was published in the 1850s after Charlotte Bronte's death, which honestly brings tears to my eyes. And I got to the end of this and I felt very emotional as you turn those last pages and realise that the story is over. But really the story is not over, because we're still talking about Charlotte Bronte all these years later, and I feel like she lives on in all of us and all of our memories of her life and her writing. It was a very touching book, and whilst I disagreed with many of Elizabeth Gaskell's takes on Charlotte's life and thought that she did spin a particular angle for good reason too, it was lovely to hear about Charlotte, to read her letters within the text, to really think about what she thought and what her values were. And it's a very Victorian biography. I think that in its own right, The Life of Charlotte Bronte is a wonderful work. Even if it wasn't about Charlotte, it would still be fantastic, because you can really delve into what it means to write a biography and why you are writing a biography and the ethics of it, which I discussed more in my vlog. So if you want to, you can go and watch my reading vlog of The Life of Charlotte Bronte, and I would recommend this to anyone who has read and loved any of the Brontes novels. Don't think it's the best place to start if you want to find out more about the Brontes, because I think it's best read if you do have some knowledge already. But I have a video about Bronte non-fiction too, so you can hear more about other books that discuss the Brontes. Also, on the subject of the Brontes, yesterday we got the news that Charlotte's little book has been bought by the Bronte Parsonage Museum at auction, and I cried when I found out the news because I was so happy. So if you watched my video about recreating one of Charlotte's little books, and if you donated yourself, then I am so happy that Charlotte's little book will be returning home to where it was first written. It is the best news. I cannot believe it. I was so happy. After that, I went back in time from the Victorian period to Shakespearean England, and I read Richard III by William Shakespeare himself. I love Shakespeare, and I'm slowly working my way through all of his plays, and this was my first history play I'd read. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Am I conflicted? Yes, because on one hand I did enjoy it. I loved how Shakespeare put his own twist on history, and actually he really created the myth of Richard III. He played on lots of the ideas that were existing in creating the play, and really has shaped our vision of who Richard III was now. But I think the reason I'm conflicted and I didn't get as much out of it as I wanted to is that I was reading it, and you don't get the same effect if you are watching it, and also I didn't read the histories in order, so I feel like there is a better order to read them. I just don't think I quite found it, and I'm not entirely sure what it is yet. So if you have any ideas about how I should read Shakespeare's history plays, then please let me know in the comments, because I really wanted to get as much out of this as possible. And I found that I had to keep looking at the notes, I had to keep googling things to consolidate my knowledge, which was not entirely limited, but reminded me when I read this that I really need to expand my knowledge more and more. I find that I'm best with the Tudors onwards rather than the Tudors backwards, and so my knowledge really came from an adaptation of one of Philippa Gregory's books, The White Queen and then The White Princess, which is not accurate in itself, and then I was looking back to everything I'd done in history lessons and then everything I'd read about subsequently, so I feel like there is a better order to reading this. But I also really appreciated how good it was, how brilliant the monologues were, how fantastic Richard was as a character who you love to hate. He is somebody that you can't love, but but you love how well crafted he is. So there is a better order. I will reread this at some point and hopefully get more out of it. I feel like I get more out of it if I watched it too, so that's an option. But I'm going to keep going with my Shakespeare reading. I just feel like at the moment I'm more suited to his comedies than I am history. So we'll see. I still really enjoyed it, got a lot out of it, just could have got more. Then the final two books I read during the Classics-a-thon were much shorter than the others, and I read one of Sylvia Plath's novellas, which is Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom. I love the bell jar, I love Sylvia Plath's poetry, particularly her Ariel collection, which I just think is genius. And I didn't really expect to love this as much as I did, but I really enjoyed it and found that it was a very interesting story following Mary Ventura as she goes on a journey by train, but things on this journey aren't quite what they seem, and she isn't entirely convinced of the destination she's going to end up at. And I'm not going to say any more than that because I think the genius of this story is that it unfurls as you are reading it and you come to your own conclusions as to what is going on. I think you could happily read this if you haven't read any of Sylvia Plath's work before, because really I think everything she writes is amazing. And then the final thing that I read during the Classics-a-thon was Sanditon by Jane Austen. I have this edition, which is a bind-up of Lady Susan, the Watsons and Sanditon. I've previously read Lady Susan, which I just adore, one of my favourite things ever, and I'm going to read the Watsons at some point, but I wanted to read Sanditon because there has been an adaptation of it recently on ITV in the UK, so I thought that I would read it before I watched it. So I read it and I liked it, but I didn't love it because there is hardly anything there. There are only 9 chapters, and so Jane Austen has barely got started. She didn't have a chance to edit it or to go back and revise anything because she died before she could finish it. And so when I come to talking about it and reviewing it, there's not a lot I can say because we don't know Jane Austen's intent. We don't know where she was going to go with the story, and what the adaptation hoped to do was to pick up where Sanditon, the book, left off and to imagine what it would be like if Jane Austen had finished it. So I watched the first episode and I just couldn't get into it. I found that there was a lot of inaccuracies or things that I just wasn't sure about, things that I thought that they misread in order to suit the story that they wanted to tell. I feel like it wasn't particularly successful as an adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, but if I wasn't going into it knowing that it was supposed to be an adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, I might have liked it more. I get what they were trying to do, don't know if they fully achieved it, and whilst I love everything that Jane Austen writes, there's not really much that you can say about the story because there's barely a story being told, but still definitely worth reading. Just maybe not your first Jane Austen. I feel like you should read her other novels first and then come to this, or read Lady Susan because Lady Susan is amazing. I wish that Jane Austen had finished it because I think there was so much potential there. Still keep thinking about lots of the characters. It is what it is. Then on to the books I have read since the end of August, and one of the best books I have read this year has been How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman, who is honestly my hero. I love her so much. She, if you don't know, used to star in lots of BBC historical recreation programmes. So she was in Victorian Farm, Tudor Farm, Edwardian Farm. She does a lot of historical living. So when you read one of her historical books, you know she knows what she's talking about. And How to Be a Victorian talks about the Victorian period and goes through what it was like to live in the Victorian period. So I love the Victorians and I love everything about Victorian literature, but I also love hearing about Victorian living. And for me, the best thing about history is social history, how ordinary people were living. And what Ruth Goodman is particularly good at is recognising that there were many people living during this time. It wasn't just rich and middle class people, there was so many people in the working class and the lower classes of society who have just as important a story to tell. And so she is amazing at bringing everybody's lives to light and shining a light on all the people you might not have heard of before. I really trust everything she says and the sources she uses because, for example, when she's talking about laundry, she has done the routine. So she is able to say, well, these are the problems, these are things that they would have struggled with, this is why they do it. And I feel like when you're looking at the past, for example, example, you look at women and think they just sit in their drawing rooms and drink tea all day and that's how the Victorians lived their life. But she's talking about working class women, she's talking about women working, she is talking about things that make you think about our perceptions and how actually there's not really that much of society removed between us now and the Victorians then. We are the same people, we just have slightly different rules, and it's those rules that govern how people live their lives and why they did things. And you read some of it and you think, well actually I feel like they were far more advanced in some things than we are now. In some ways we have gone backwards, and in other ways they were more forwards, and in other ways things have progressed an awful lot, and you're so grateful that you live in society now. But if you want to find out more about the Victorian period, you cannot go wrong with How to Be a Victorian. It is just the best book I've read all year. I'm so in love with it. Back on to fiction then, and I read Anne of the Island by L.M. Montgomery, who I have been trying to read. I've been pacing myself because I don't want to read all of the books all in one go, but I love Anne as a character. She is one of my favourites and I've been loving reading these stories, and I feel like Anne of the Island might be my favourite yet, and I knew that going into it I was going to love it because I knew that the places that L.M. Montgomery was going to take the story was going to be great, but I didn't anticipate loving it as much as I did, and I fell head over heels in love with this book. And the last chapter is just one of the best scenes in literature. It warmed my heart, brings tears to my eyes. I reread it a lot. I just love it. And I love Anne. I love all of the characters. There was lots more characters introduced in this. Some of the ones I didn't like as much in Anne of Avonlea were taken out, so I was happy about that. And we really see a difference in Anne as she grows up in this book. She moves away from Avonlea, she goes to college or university, does she call it? I'm not sure. And she trains to become a teacher, and that takes her on many wonderful adventures, as is always the case in an Anne of Green Gables novel. And once again, I cannot fault Ellen Montgomery's writing, which is pure magic. Another children's book, and I read the eagerly awaited Pages & Co. sequel, which is Tilly and the Lost Fairy Tales. I loved Tilly and the Book Wanderers when I read it last year and have been so looking forward to reading this. I read this on a train up to Yorkshire and I had to stop myself because I didn't want to read it all in one go. And I love the places that Anna James took the story this time. I loved working out everything that had happened at the end of Tilly and the Book Wanderers and seeing how that changed everything for the characters in the sequel. And now I finished it, I just need the third book because I love this series. I love how it is book magic. It draws on a love of books and a love of reading in bringing book characters to life, in bringing fairy tale characters to life in this book. And Tilly is one of the most endearing characters ever written. So if you have a young person in your life, then you need to make them read this series. But equally, I think it can be enjoyed by a book lover of any age. Another absolute children's classic that I had never read before and so many people had told me to read. I've had a few hate comments, if I'm honest, about people telling me to read this and asking me if I'm stupid for not reading it, which, I mean, fair enough. I mean, no need to be nasty, but I hadn't read it. So I decided that I was going to read this book in October when I should have been reading for Victober, but I read the first chapter and then couldn't stop. It is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, the first book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. I've read Book of Dust, didn't love it, if I'm honest. Didn't really feel like it was for me, didn't really feel like it was my thing, but I could appreciate the story that was being told. So I wasn't sure if I was going to read this, but I've been told that the original trilogy is a must read and it's recently been adapted for TV too, so I thought I might want to watch the series, which is on BBC. So I read it and I fell in love with it. I loved it. I feel like I would have got more out of this maybe as a child, or if I had been of the era when it was really popular, but I could still appreciate the story that was happening, still loved Lyra so much. But I'm unconvinced that this is a children's book, and I feel like that might be a controversial thing to say, but I feel like there is so much dark stuff going on in it that yes, it can be read by children, but also I feel like now it's best read if you're an adult. Like, I feel very conflicted on this because I feel like there wouldn't have been a problem if I had read it as a child. As an adult now, I just feel like, well, this is for me. So it's one of those ones where I feel like it is quite a universal book. I would be interested to know your thoughts. So I don't really know what to think of it, but I'm going to keep reading this series. I'm looking forward to seeing where it's going. I'm interested to know what my demon would be. The BBC did this quiz and I got a gecko, which I think is very inaccurate. I wonder, if you're watching this, what do you think my demon would be? I'm not sure. And then finally, that draws me on to the only book I read for Victober, which I was so disappointed about. I wanted to read so much in October for the Victober readathon, but it just didn't work out and I spent ages reading this book. But oh my gosh, what a good book to read. I mean, I could have read 50 books of Victober that I didn't enjoy, but I read one that I loved so much, and I've got a new author that I really, really love, and it is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who I just... this book is so good. Please read it if you haven't already. It was published for the first time in 1862 when sensation novels were becoming very popular. If you've read The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, there are many similarities between the two stories, but I like to say that Lady Audley's Secret is slightly superior. I loved The Woman in White, but I feel like the thing about it is it's very rambly and doesn't get to the point when it should get to the point, but this is just so spot on. Her sentences, every sentence is beautiful. Her language is incredible. The way that she weaves the story makes you believe in it. I'd actually quite like to do a spoiler discussion on this to really talk about it in detail, because there are so many things I could discuss, so many elements that are worth talking about to do with Victorian society and the way that Mary Elizabeth Braddon uses the things around her, the things that were popular and in conversation at the time, to create a shocking story, but also one that sheds light on some of the more sordid areas of Victorian society. The way that a sensation novel works, the way that it makes readers feel the way that they do, and particularly Victorian readers would have felt, is that what a sensation novel does is that it picks out all the things that are important to that society. So the Victorians were very keen on the family unit. The family unit was a very important thing, and without that, they thought that society would collapse, basically. So what Mary Elizabeth Braddon does is takes that perfect family unit and she pulls it apart. As she pulls it apart, all these horrific things happen, and you look more closely about how everything is linked together, how everything is tied up, how if you take away one thing, then everything else can crumble down, and how you take one figure and they might seem perfect on the surface, but actually they aren't. And she has this wonderful way of narrating the story so that as you are reading it, your allegiances change, they shift. So when you're reading from Lady Audley, you have this tendency to lean into her and to really not even relate, but to feel sorry for her, to empathise with her. Then you hear the story from Robert Audley's perspective and your allegiances change to tie with him. And so as a reader, you have a slight conflict of interest as you're reading it, because you aren't really sure who you're supposed to be rooting for, even though morally you know that there is only one person who is on the right side of the law. I will say that whilst I did like the ending, I didn't think it was the most fitting ending, and I wish she had taken it to slightly more of an extreme. I feel like it was the ending that she maybe wanted to write, the happily ever after ending, but I don't necessarily think that it did the story full justice, because sometimes I think the most shocking things are when you go, whoa, I saw that coming, but I didn't think you were going to take me there. But she is like, oh, let's just tie it all up very neatly, and I kind of think that might have ruined the effect, but didn't ruin it altogether, because altogether this is a fantastic book that I get why she ended it in that way. I get why that's a satisfying ending for Victorian readers. For me, I wanted her to push the boundaries a little bit, and I don't feel like she fully did that. But my god, what a book Lady Audley's Secret is. I'm so excited to read more of Mary Elizabeth Braddon's books. Not sure exactly what I'm going to read next, but I just can't wait. I love her so much. I love everywhere she took me with this book, all the emotions. I just had the best reading experience, and I want everybody to experience this book like I did, please read it. If you've made it this far through this video, I insist that you have to read Lady Audley's Secret now. So that was my reading wrap up for the past few months. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you picked up some recommendations, or maybe I discussed a book that you've really loved or maybe really hated. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. I'd also love to know what you have been reading recently and what your favourite and least favourite book has been. So I'll be back hopefully now with the regular monthly reading wrap up, so you'll get to see soon what I've read during November, December and so on into the new year. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!